When most people imagine early Christians praying, they picture something that looks a lot like a modern Sunday morning service. Heads bowed, eyes closed, hands folded, voices hushed. But that image is almost entirely wrong. The first followers of Jesus prayed nothing like that. The way they prayed when they prayed, the words they used, the posture of their bodies, and the communal rhythms they kept would feel completely foreign to most Christians sitting in a church today. So here is the question you need to sit with. If the early church prayed so differently from us, what exactly did we miss? By the time this video ends, you will understand 1. The specific daily prayer rhythms that shaped every single hour of the first Christian communities. 2. The radical thing that changed about prayer the moment Jesus taught his disciples to say one specific word. And 3. The hidden practice buried inside first-century Jewish prayer that the early church inherited and that almost no one today talks about. A practice that could completely reframe how you approach God. Let's immerse ourselves in Jerusalem in the first decade of what we call the Common Era, roughly 30 to 60 years after the birth of Jesus. This is not the Jerusalem of stained glass and organ music. This is a city that smells like stone dust and roasting grain. The Temple of Herod the Great dominates the skyline, rising above everything else like a mountain built by human hands. It is the center of the world for every Jewish person living in and around that city. And prayer in this world is not private. It is not optional. It is not spontaneous in the way we tend to think of prayer today. Prayer in first-century Judaism is structured, public, and rhythmic. It is woven into the fabric of daily life the same way meals and sleep are woven in. There are 3 appointed hours every day when the faithful stop and turn toward the temple. The 3rd hour, which is 9 in the morning. The 6th hour, noon, and the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon. These were not suggestions, they were the architecture of the day itself. The central Jewish prayer recited at these hours was something called the Amidah, which literally means the standing prayer because you stood to recite it. It contained 19 blessings, not requests so much as declarations and acknowledgments. Blessings over God's faithfulness, over the restoration of Israel, over the coming of the Messiah. Every Jewish man in Jerusalem knew it by heart. It was as automatic as breathing, and the early followers of Jesus, they did not walk away from all of this. They were Jewish. Acts chapter 2 tells us plainly that the first 3,000 converts to the way of Jesus were Jewish people who had lived and prayed inside this exact framework their entire lives. The apostles went to the temple to pray. They kept the hours. They observed the rhythms. They were not inventing a new religion from scratch. They were pressing an old and living tradition through the filter of everything they had seen and heard in Jesus. But something had shifted, something enormous, and it was buried inside a single word that Jesus had given them. Let me read it. Matthew chapter 6 verses 7 through 13. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Matthew chapter 6, verses 7 through 13. Read that again slowly in your mind. Notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say, pray these exact words and nothing else. He says, pray like this. He is handing his followers a shape, a model, a skeleton. He is not abolishing the old framework of Jewish prayer. He is doing something far more disorienting. He is inserting himself right at the entrance of it. And it all hinges on 2 words at the very beginning. That's the opening 4 sections, landing at roughly 810 words. The 2 words at the very beginning cliffhanger sets up the word study on Abba cleanly for the next half, ready to continue from section 5 whenever you are. Our Father, 2 words. In English they sound gentle, almost liturgical, like something you would carve above the entrance of a chapel. We have heard them so many times they have gone smooth. But in the world of a first-century Jewish disciple, those 2 words were not smooth, they were sharp, they were strange, they were nearly scandalous. What is absolutely crucial to note is what Jewish prayer actually sounded like before Jesus. In the great synagogue prayers of that era, the 18 benedictions that observant Jews prayed 3 times every single day, God was addressed as Lord, as King, as the Holy One, as the Rock of Israel, as the Almighty. These were not cold titles. They were solemn, weighty, appropriate terms for a God whose holiness was so consuming that certain rabbis refused even to pronounce his personal name aloud. The dominant posture of Jewish prayer was reverence, distance, awe. You approached God the way a subject approaches a throne, carefully, with protocol. With an acute awareness of the immeasurable gap between the human and the divine, the Hebrew scriptures did occasionally use the image of fatherhood for God. In Deuteronomy, God calls Israel his son. In Isaiah, the people cry out, "You are our Father." But these were national metaphors. They described a corporate relationship between God and the entire people across generations. They were not invitations to personal intimacy. Nobody walked into the temple courts and called God their Father the way a child calls across a room. What most people miss entirely is that when Jesus taught his followers to open their mouths and say, "Our Father," he was doing something that had no precise parallel in the religious world around him. He was collapsing the distance. He was pulling the throne into the kitchen, and the word underneath the word is where the real earthquake happens. The Greek text of Matthew gives us Pater, Father, but Jesus did not speak Greek in his daily life, he spoke Aramaic. And the Aramaic word he almost certainly used, the word scholars have recovered from his other recorded prayers. The word Paul quotes in two separate letters written to Greek-speaking churches in Rome and in Galatia because it was so vivid that a Greek translation would have drained it of its power is this: Abba, say it slowly. Abba, this is not a formal title. It is not a liturgical honorific. In 1st century Aramaic, Abba was the word a small child used when calling out to their father in the street. It is closer in feeling to Papa, to Dad, to the instinctive word a child speaks before they are old enough to know that a more dignified option exists. The great German New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias spent decades combing through every Jewish prayer document and rabbinic text he could find from the period before and around Jesus. His conclusion was unambiguous. He could not find a single example of any Jewish person in any prayer addressing God as Abba before Jesus modeled it. Not one. The intimacy Jesus was offering was not a refinement of existing practice. It was a rupture. A clean break with everything the religious architecture of that world had taught people to expect, and this is not a small detail. This is the architecture of everything that follows in Christian prayer. But I have not told you the most important part yet. Think about the people who first heard Jesus teach this. These were not seminary students working through a comparative religion curriculum. These were fishermen, tax collectors, women who had been told in 100 ways that God was for other people, people more qualified than them. These were people who carried the weight of debt, of shame, of a religious system that made holiness feel like a ladder they could never quite reach the top of. And Jesus looks at them and says, "When you open your mouth toward heaven, the first word out of it is the name a child uses for a loving father. Not Lord, not Almighty, not Most High. Not please hear me, I know I am not worthy. Abba, here is the question I want you to sit with for just a moment. When you pray, what do you actually believe about the being on the other end? Because the word shapes the posture, and the posture shapes everything. Here is where it gets really interesting. When Paul writes to the church in Rome in the mid-50s of the 1st century, roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, he makes a startling claim about prayer. He says that those who belong to Christ have received a spirit of adoption and that this same spirit causes them to cry out, Abba, Father. He uses the same Aramaic word, writing in Greek. To a predominantly Gentile church, he could have used the Greek word, he chose not to. He preserved the sound of the original because the sound carried the meaning. The earliest Gentile Christians, people who had grown up praying to Zeus and Apollo and the household gods of Rome, were learning to open their mouths and say a word in a language most of them had never spoken before. They were not just learning a new prayer form, they were being given a new identity, and this matters enormously in the Roman world. Because Rome had its own theology of divine fatherhood. The emperor held the official title Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. It was not metaphor, it was political theology. The emperor was the father from whom all provision, all protection, all order in the known world was understood to flow downward. When early Christians gathered and cried out Abba toward heaven, they were doing something that was not merely devotional. They were declaring, in effect, that their father was not Caesar, that their ultimate source was not the empire, that their deepest allegiance ran vertically before it ran horizontally. Prayer in the early church was not a private spiritual habit tucked into the margins of a normal life. It was a public confession of where you stood. The principle here is this: the name you use when you pray is a statement of what you believe about God and what you believe about yourself in relation to Him. Jesus did not give His followers a ritual. He gave them an identity packed into a single Aramaic syllable that reorganized every other relationship in their lives around it. Imagine a modern-day scenario. Picture someone who grew up in a home where their father was distant, transactional, perpetually impossible to please. They move through life with a kind of permanent flinch. They approach authority already braced for disapproval. They perform, they over-explain, they apologize before they have done anything wrong. Now tell that person when you approach the God who made the universe, you begin with Abba, Dad, the one who already knows what you need before you say it, not the one you have to convince, not the one grading your vocabulary, not the audience you have to win, the one who is already leaning toward you before you finish drawing your first breath. That is not a minor comfort, that is a complete restructuring of the self. The principle here is this: what Jesus handed the early church was not a new technique for religious performance. He was giving them a new story about who they were, written in the grammar of prayer itself, spoken out loud every single morning. Here is the ending of the script, continuing directly from where the narration leaves off. So let me give you 3 steps rooted in exactly what the earliest believers actually did. Step 1. Rebuild your prayer around address before petition. Biblical mandate Matthew 6:9. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. The first word you speak in prayer positions every word that follows, so getting the address right shifts the entire posture automatically. Action for this week: before you make a single request, spend 60 unrushed seconds doing nothing but speaking who God is to you. Name Him out loud. Father Maker, the one who already knows, let the address fully settle before the asking begins. Step 2. Pray with at least one other person before the week ends. Biblical mandate Acts 2:42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. The early church's default mode for prayer was plural. Private prayer grew out of communal prayer, not the other way around. Action for this week: find one person and agree to pray together once before Friday. Not a long event, 5 minutes. The point is not the duration. The point is that you are not the only voice in the room, and the room changes when it is not. Step 3. Anchor your day with fixed prayer times instead of reactive ones. Biblical mandate Psalm 55:17. Evening, morning, and noon I cry out in distress, and He hears my voice. The early believers did not invent the rhythm of praying at set hours. They inherited it and deliberately placed the prayer Jesus gave them at the center of that rhythm, twice, 3 times every single day. Action for this week: choose 2 fixed moments, morning and evening, and say the Lord's Prayer in full at each one, not as a recitation, as a declaration. Say it slowly enough that every phrase has a moment to land. But I have not told you the most important part yet. Finally, let's bring it all together with something the earliest church knew that most modern believers have nearly completely forgotten. There is a document called the Didache. That is a Greek word meaning teaching. It is the oldest surviving church manual in existence, dating to somewhere around the close of the 1st century. It was written to guide new believers in the practices of the community they were joining. And buried inside its instructions on prayer is a single line that stops you cold the moment you read it. After quoting the Lord's Prayer in full, the Didache gives this instruction: pray this 3 times a day. Not when you feel the need, not when life becomes too heavy to carry alone, 3 times, every day without exception. The early church was not told to treat prayer as a resource you reach for in emergencies. They were told to rebuild the entire architecture of their daily hours around this one prayer, morning, midday, and evening, so that the shape of their time was itself a statement about who they belonged to. And here is what makes that genuinely breathtaking once you understand the world they inhabited. Every observant Jewish person in that world already prayed 3 times daily. That was the rhythm of the Amidah, the standing prayer, the backbone of Jewish devotional life for generations before Jesus was born. The early Jewish followers of Jesus did not abandon that rhythm. They redeemed it. They poured entirely new content into the same ancient container. And in doing that, they were making a declaration loud enough for the whole street to hear: our daily structure belongs to the God Jesus revealed. Not to the emperor, not to the market, not to whatever voice holds power over us today. 3 times a day we stop, we face the Father, we speak the kingdom into the present tense. We announce that His name and no other name is the axis around which this particular day turns. That is how the early Christians prayed, not as a spiritual supplement added onto a life lived on somebody else's terms, as the central organizing act that gave the whole day its shape, its direction, and its meaning. So here are the 2 questions I want you to sit with today. What would actually change in your life if you stopped praying reactively and started praying structurally? And the harder one: when you say the Lord's Prayer, are you reading a script or are you reading the story of who you actually are? If this video opened something up for you, subscribe right now, because we go deep on exactly these kinds of questions every single week. And if you want to keep going, the video coming up next is on how the early church actually reads scripture. And I promise you, the way they handled the written word is every bit as surprising as everything you just heard about prayer.